Race and racism. How much do you know?
Why should the color of a person's skin influence whether they're more likely to be killed by the police? In order to answer this question, we need to understand the concept of race. Many of us can give an answer when asked to categorize an individual's race, but do we understand what race really means? In the US and in South Africa, the most important racial categories are black and white. So are white people biologically different from black people? The short answer is no. Race is a social, not a biological, concept. But before going into the social construction of race, let's talk about biology. As humans, we evolved over a long process, stretching back millions of years. Modern humans evolved some 200 to 300,000 years ago. Given the environment in which early humans evolved, those first humans would have had high levels of melanin. Melanin is the chemical in our skin that acts like sunscreen. The more melanin a person has, the less damage the sun's radiation can do to them. Those early humans would have had a lot of melanin. Their complexion would have been quite dark. We can't call those early humans black people in racial terms. Without white people, there are no black people, just people. So what about people with less melanin, people with lighter skin? How did they evolve? One thing that separates humans from most other species is that we are extremely adaptable. Is there any other species that can live in very cold, very hot, very dry, and very wet climates? But as early humans moved to the northern parts of Europe and Asia, they faced a problem. The melanin that was protecting them from the sun was now a liability. Most people know that plants depend on the sun for energy. But did you know that humans also depend on the sun? Vitamin D is an important pre-hormone that we make out of cholesterol when the sun hits our skin. Low levels of vitamin D lead to a condition called rickets, which involves softening of the bones. Melanin impairs the metabolization of vitamin D and other essential chemicals we get from the sun. The darker our skin, the more difficult it is for us to get those nutrients from the sun. This was not a problem for early humans who lived near the equator and got more sun than they needed. But as some humans moved north and south, they lost the capacity to produce as much melanin. Thus, they could make enough vitamin D out of less and poorer quality sunlight. And since there are humans living at almost every latitude on the planet, there are a wide variety of human skin tones indicating different melanin levels. Many people can also darken or lighten their skin tone just by spending time in the sun or avoiding it, what we usually call tanning. All of this has nothing to do with race or with the global phenomenon of anti-black racism. Thus, almost 2,000 years ago, it was not unusual for an African, Septimus Severus, to claim and hold the title of Roman Emperor. The fact that most Romans had lighter skin than he did does not seem to have been a point of contention. Only fairly recently, in the 17th and 18th centuries of the Common Era, race theory began to be elaborated in its modern form. So what were the early European theorists of race, among them François Bernier, Immanuel Kant, and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, thinking? Why did they feel the need to invent race? Did they understand the trouble they were causing? There is a traditional way of understanding the origins of race theory. According to this theory, these scientists and philosophers were at the cutting edge of developing what we know today as the natural and social sciences. One key feature of natural science in particular was the idea of categorization. Just as plants and animals could be divided into different categories, theorists believed that there were different categories of people based on things like skin color and hair type. Despite their claims that the race classification was based on some objective conception of the universal, Kant, for example, was concerned with dividing humans based on a universal concept of beauty, Europeans always ended up as the most perfect society on the planet. Needless to say that all people who came up with these notions were, or what we might call white today. Why did race theory become popular? Why did it cement itself in the European consciousness so dramatically that we still face its implications today? The interesting thing is that most of these theorists were not taken seriously in their time. Those that were, Kant for example, became famous despite their writings on race, not because of them. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had expanded its reach all over the world. The transatlantic trade in enslaved people was at its height. Native populations of the Americas were being killed indiscriminately by Europeans. How is this carnage and brutality in keeping with the values of a people who consider themselves civilized and enlightened? This is precisely the time when some of the same theorists who are inventing race are arguing against feudal systems based on a distinction between nobles, the aristocracy, and everyone else. The idea that, quote, all men are created equal is enshrined in no less a document than the US Declaration of Independence, and as a self-evident truth. The newly formed republic would soon ramp up its systemic persecution and genocide of the native peoples of the Americas, and would continue to rely on the enslavement of people of African descent for nearly another century. So how did they reconcile the language of equality with the brutal persecution of non-Europeans? Well, clearly those who signed their name to a statement that all men are created equal, and then continued to enslave some men, had to have a justification for doing so. And this is where race theory really takes off. The science behind race theory was always terrible. For a start, a person's characteristics are to a large extent determined by culture more than biology. This is the old nature versus nurture debate. There are some genetic strains which are more associated with people from one geography or another, but these generally have to do with adaptations made for a given environment. In terms of what it usually claims to be, a plausible explanation of human variation, race theory never succeeded. But in terms of its social purpose, race theory has been a huge success. The people who were being wiped out in the Americas could be said to deserve their fate because of racial inferiority. Sometimes this was linked to a religious inferiority due to the perceived superiority of the European Christian faith, but Europeans weren't averse to being brutal to Native Americans and people of African descent, even if they were Christians. Racism in this context became the main feature of what was needed to maintain European power. In order for the colonial project to generate any wealth for Europeans, they needed two things: land and labor. Land to grow things like cotton and sugarcane, or to find things like gold and diamonds, and labor to harvest those products in order to manufacture them into finished goods. Racism created a social structure within which it was possible, even desirable, to murder the people who were on the land and to enslave the people who would provide much of the labor. And it is this system, sometimes called a racialized caste system, that continues to this day. We see it at the level of statistics. Black men in the US are more likely than white men to be the victims of police brutality when adjusted for population size. Black women are far more likely to die due to complications related to childbirth than white women. Sometimes this is portrayed as a flaw in the system, a betrayal of ideas that founded societies that would otherwise have been egalitarian. But when you consider the history, the division between those who own property and those who were property is a foundational element of many of our societies. To move forward, we need fundamental transformation. So how do we move forward? That's a difficult question and one we'll be addressing in future videos. As a first step, we must acknowledge that there are institutions in our society. While they may do some things that are useful, their primary purpose is to enforce the distinction between the haves and the have-nots. Those institutions probably can't be reformed, but they can be defunded. Funds taken from those institutions can go to places where they might at least have a chance at undoing the gross injustices upon which our societies are built. If that seems daunting, consider that we're only a generation or two removed from institutions that seemed invincible. Apartheid in Southern Africa only ended in the 1990s. The US Civil Rights Act was passed less than 30 years before that. The color barrier has been crossed even in the presidency of the United States. That doesn't mean that we should rest on our laurels or claim easy victories, but it does mean that whatever the next step in this struggle might be, we're building on a proud legacy, a legacy of justice.
Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
You were listening to Race and Racism. How Much Do You Know? By Samir Dosani for Peace Vigil. Peace Vigil works for peace education by sharing knowledge from history and the contemporary world that can protect and promote peace. Please help this work by subscribing to this channel and sharing this video. Thank you.